The advertisement was crumpled in her coat pocket, ink smeared by desperate fingers and Irish rain. Clarice Hartley stood at the crossroads where the cobblestone ended and dirt began, her 2-year-old son Benji heavy against her hip, his small fist clutching her worn shawl. The words echoed in her mind like a prayer she wasn't sure she believed. A room for your baby, and a bed for you. No man spoke so plainly about such arrangements without knowing exactly what he meant. But hunger had a way of making impossible choices feel inevitable, and the last of her coins had bought nothing but time that was already running out. Subscribe to witness how desperation can become the first step toward salvation. The farmhouse appeared through the mist, like something carved from the very stones of County Clare itself, weathered grey walls rising from earth that seemed to swallow the horizon. Clarice's boots sank into mud that pulled at her ankles with each step, as if the land itself questioned her right to be there. Benji had grown quiet against her shoulder, his usual chatter silenced by the strange heaviness that seemed to press down from the low-hanging clouds. She could smell peat smoke curling from the chimney, mixing with the sharp scent of wet wool and something else, something that spoke of meals cooked for one, of silence that had grown comfortable with itself. The windows stared back at her like eyes that had seen too much and expected nothing, their glass reflecting her own pale face and the uncertainty that clung to her like morning fog. Thomas Callahan emerged from the barn before she reached the door, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if he had been expecting her arrival at precisely this moment. He was taller than she had imagined, with shoulders that spoke of years spent wrestling with stubborn earth and unforgiving weather. His dark hair was touched with premature silver at the temples, and his eyes, green as the fields that stretched beyond his property, held a directness that made her stomach flutter with something between fear and relief. He wore no expression of judgment as he took in her travel-stained dress, her son's tear-streaked face, the way her hands trembled despite her efforts to appear composed. Instead, he simply nodded, as if her presence confirmed something he had already decided. When he spoke, his voice carried the soft lilt of his heritage, but underneath lay something harder, more certain than the words themselves. "You'll be the woman from the advertisement," he said, and it wasn't a question. His gaze moved to Benji, who had lifted his head to stare at this stranger with the solemn curiosity of a child who had learned too early that the world was full of uncertainties. Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the calluses on his hands, the way his shirt stretched across his chest with each breath. "The boy looks hungry," he observed, and there was no accusation in his tone, only a statement of fact that made her throat tighten with shame. She couldn't quite swallow. She had tried so hard to keep Benji fed, to maintain the illusion that they were simply traveling, not fleeing, not desperate, not reduced to answering advertisements that promised shelter in exchange for arrangements that proper women didn't discuss in daylight. But children couldn't survive on pride, and her own stomach had been empty for 2 days. "We both are," she admitted, the words scraping against her throat like broken glass. It was the first honest thing she had said to a stranger in months, and the admission left her feeling raw and exposed, as if she had stripped away more than just pretense. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and she found herself holding her breath, waiting for the judgment that never came. Instead, he turned toward the house, his boots squelching in the mud, and gestured for her to follow. "Then we'd best get you both inside," he said simply, as if the solution to her desperation was as straightforward as coming in from the rain. The ease of his acceptance made her chest ache with something she couldn't name. Gratitude, perhaps, or the dangerous beginning of hope. She had grown so accustomed to doors closing in her face that she had forgotten what it felt like when one opened. The interior of the farmhouse was sparse but clean, furnished with the kind of practical simplicity that spoke of a man who had learned to live without excess. The main room held a stone fireplace where flames danced against blackened walls, casting shadows that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the wind outside. A wooden table dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred by years of use but polished to a warm glow that suggested care despite the solitude. Thomas moved through the space with the efficiency of someone who had long ago established routines that required no thought, lighting an oil lamp that pushed back the gathering dusk, stirring something in a pot that hung over the fire. The smell that rose from it, beef and vegetables and herbs she couldn't identify, made Benji whimper with longing, and she felt her own mouth water despite the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. This was real food, the kind that could fill the hollow spaces that had been growing inside them both for weeks. "Sit," Thomas said, indicating the chairs beside the table, and his tone brooked no argument. Clarice lowered herself carefully, settling Benji on her lap, acutely aware of how out of place they must look in this masculine domain. Her dress, once a respectable blue wool, now bore the stains of their journey: mud from the roads, tears from Benji's frightened crying, the general greyness that came from too many nights in cheap lodgings where soap was a luxury they couldn't afford. She watched Thomas ladle the stew into bowls, his movements economical and sure, and wondered what he saw when he looked at them. A woman who had fallen so far from respectability that she would answer an advertisement that promised shelter in exchange for sharing a bed with a stranger. A child who deserved better than a mother who had run out of choices. The weight of her failures pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe, harder still to accept the kindness he offered so matter-of-factly. The first spoonful of stew hit her empty stomach like a revelation, rich and warming in a way that made her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. Benji ate with the desperate efficiency of a child who had learned not to waste food, his small hands gripping the spoon with fierce concentration, his eyes never leaving the bowl as if he feared it might disappear. Thomas sat across from them, his own meal forgotten as he watched them eat, and there was something in his expression that made her chest tighten. Not pity exactly, but a recognition that spoke of his own familiarity with hunger, with the kind of desperation that made pride a luxury one couldn't afford. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of eating and the occasional pop from the fire, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like a reprieve, a moment suspended outside the harsh realities that had driven her to his door. When Benji's eyelids began to droop, his small body finally relaxed by warmth and food, Thomas rose from his chair with the same quiet efficiency he had shown since their arrival. "The boy needs sleep," he said, and it wasn't a suggestion. He led them up a narrow staircase that creaked under their weight, past walls lined with photographs of people she didn't recognize, family, perhaps, or friends who had moved on to other places, other lives. The room he showed them was small but clean, with a narrow bed pushed against one wall and a window that looked out over fields that disappeared into darkness. A quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed, its pattern simple but carefully stitched, and she wondered who had made it, whose hands had worked the fabric with such obvious care. The thought of another woman in this house, in Thomas's life, sent an unexpected pang through her chest that she quickly pushed aside. "This will do for the boy," Thomas said, his voice softer now, as if the presence of a sleeping child demanded a different kind of reverence. He helped her settle Benji under the quilt, and she was surprised by the gentleness of his large hands as he tucked the fabric around her son's small form. Benji sighed in his sleep, a sound of such complete contentment that it made her throat ache with gratitude and something deeper, more dangerous. For the first time in months, her child was warm, fed, safe. The relief was so overwhelming that she had to grip the edge of the bed to keep from swaying. Thomas noticed her unsteadiness, his hand moving instinctively to steady her elbow, and the contact sent a shock of awareness through her that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the fact that she was a woman who had been alone too long. "And now we discuss the arrangement," he said, his voice returning to that matter-of-fact tone that somehow made the impossible seem reasonable. They stood in the narrow hallway between the child's room and what she assumed was his own, the space so small that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of soap and honest work that clung to his skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for him to name his price, to outline the terms of the bargain she had already agreed to by walking through his door. She had prepared herself for this moment during the long walk from town, had rehearsed the words she would use to maintain some shred of dignity while surrendering what remained of her respectability. But Thomas surprised her, as he had been doing since the moment she arrived, by simply opening the door to his room and stepping aside. The bedroom was as spare as the rest of the house, dominated by a bed that was larger than she had expected, but still unmistakably meant for one. A washstand stood in the corner, topped with a basin and pitcher that gleamed white in the lamplight, and a single chair held clothes that had been folded with military precision. The walls were bare, except for a crucifix that hung above the headboard, its simple wooden form a reminder of faith that had somehow survived whatever hardships had shaped this solitary man. Thomas moved to the washstand, pouring water into the basin, with movements that suggested this was part of his nightly routine, and she realized with a start that he was preparing for bed, as if her presence changed nothing about his established patterns. The normalcy of it was somehow more unsettling than any crude demand would have been. "You'll want to wash," he said, without turning around, his voice carefully neutral. "There's soap in the dish and clean towels in the chest." He paused, his hands stilling on the pitcher, and when he spoke again, his words carried a weight that made her breath catch. "I won't touch you unless you ask me to," he said quietly, and the promise hung in the air between them like something sacred. "But I won't pretend I don't want to." The honesty of it hit her like a physical blow, stripping away the careful pretenses they had both been maintaining. Here was a man who could have demanded anything, who held all the power in their unequal arrangement, offering her a choice she hadn't expected to have. The kindness of it, the unexpected mercy, made her knees weak with something that wasn't entirely relief. She stood frozen in the doorway, watching as he turned down the lamp until the room was bathed in soft shadows that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the wind outside. Thomas moved to the far side of the bed, his back to her, as he began the simple ritual of preparing for sleep, and she realized that he was giving her space to decide, time to choose how this night would unfold. The weight of that choice settled on her shoulders like a mantle. She wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear, but for the first time in months, the decision was hers to make. In the world that had taken so much from her, that small gift of agency felt like the beginning of something she didn't dare name. "Continue com os capítulos 3 to 5, por favor." The morning came with the kind of silence that settles over places where people are still learning how to breathe around each other. Clarice woke to the sound of Thomas moving through the house below, his boots careful against the wooden floors, as if he too understood that something fragile had taken root in the spaces between them. Benji stirred beside her, his small fist curled against her shoulder, and for the first time in months she didn't feel the immediate panic of wondering where their next meal would come from. The relief was so profound it made her chest ache, a reminder that safety, when it finally arrives, can feel as overwhelming as the danger that preceded it. She dressed quietly, smoothing her worn dress and running her fingers through hair that hadn't seen a proper mirror in weeks. The woman who looked back at her from the small glass above the washstand was a stranger, thinner than she remembered, with eyes that held too much knowledge of the world's capacity for cruelty. But there was something else there now, a flicker of something that might have been hope, and she found herself straightening her shoulders as if preparing for a battle she might actually win. The house around her felt different in the daylight. Less like a shelter and more like a place where people might actually live, where the walls held the possibility of laughter instead of just the echo of loneliness. When she made her way downstairs, Thomas was already at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands and his eyes fixed on something beyond the window that she couldn't see. He looked up when she entered, and she caught something in his expression, a vulnerability quickly masked, as if he too was navigating the strange territory of having someone else in his space. "There's coffee," he said, gesturing toward the pot on the stove, and his voice carried the same careful neutrality as the night before, but underneath it she heard something softer, an invitation that went beyond the simple offer of caffeine. She poured herself a cup, grateful for the warmth that spread through her fingers and the bitter comfort of something hot and real. They sat in silence for a while, the morning light streaming through windows that probably hadn't seen a woman's touch in years, and she found herself cataloguing the small details of his life, the way he held his cup with both hands, the careful distance he maintained even while sharing the same table, the way his eyes kept drifting to the stairs as if he was listening for sounds of Benji waking. There was something almost protective in his attention, and it stirred something in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "I can work," she said finally, the words coming out more abruptly than she'd intended. "I was a nurse before. I know about healing, about taking care of things." She watched his face as she spoke, searching for signs of judgment or dismissal, but found instead a quiet consideration that made her feel seen in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. The offer hung between them like a bridge. She wasn't sure either of them was ready to cross, but the building of it felt necessary, a way of establishing that she wasn't just taking from him, but had something to give in return. Thomas nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup in a gesture that spoke of old habits and careful thought. "The land's been hard on me lately," he said, and she heard in his voice the weight of seasons that had taken more than they'd given, of a man who'd been carrying too much alone for too long. "Could use someone who knows about healing." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of an agreement that went deeper than employment, a recognition that they both had wounds that might benefit from tending, and that perhaps, in the careful space they were creating between them, there might be room for both of them to begin again. The days that followed took on a rhythm that surprised them both with its naturalness, as if the three of them had been practicing this dance of domestic cooperation in some other life, and were simply remembering the steps. Clarice found herself moving through the house with increasing confidence, her hands learning the particular temperament of Thomas's kitchen, the way the old stove required coaxing, and the precise angle needed to keep the back door from sticking. Benji, with the adaptability that belongs only to the very young, claimed the house as his own territory, his laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long, his small presence transforming corners that had held only shadows into spaces filled with the bright chaos of childhood. Thomas watched this transformation with something that might have been wonder, though he was careful to keep his observations quiet and unobtrusive. She would catch him sometimes, pausing in his work to listen to Benji's chatter, or following with his eyes the way Clarice moved through his space, bringing order and warmth to places that had grown cold with neglect. There was something almost reverent in his attention, as if he was witnessing a miracle he didn't quite trust himself to believe in, and she found herself moving more carefully under his gaze, aware that she was not just caring for his home, but somehow healing something in him that had been broken long before she arrived. The work came easily to her hands, muscle memory returning as she tended to the small injuries that were part of Thomas's daily existence. Cuts from barbed wire, burns from the forge, the deep ache in his shoulders from years of carrying more than one man should bear alone. He submitted to her ministrations with a quiet grace that spoke of a man unaccustomed to being cared for, his eyes following her movements as she cleaned and bandaged and soothed, as if he was trying to memorize the sensation of gentle hands and healing touch. In these moments, the careful distance they maintained dissolved into something more intimate, a recognition that they were both wounded creatures learning to trust again. Benji became the bridge between them, his innocent demands for attention and affection creating opportunities for connection that neither adult would have dared to seek on their own. Thomas would find himself on the floor, showing the boy how to whittle simple shapes from scraps of wood, his large hands guiding small fingers with a patience that revealed depths of tenderness he'd kept carefully hidden. Clarice would watch these interactions with something that felt dangerously close to longing, seeing in Thomas's careful attention to her son the kind of father Benji had never known, the steady presence that could anchor a child's world and make it safe. The evenings were the hardest and the sweetest, when the work of the day was done and they found themselves gathered around the kitchen table, the lamplight creating a circle of warmth that felt almost like family. They would talk in careful increments, sharing pieces of their histories like offerings, testing the weight of trust and finding it stronger than either had dared to hope. Thomas spoke of the farm his father had built and lost, of dreams deferred, and the particular loneliness of a man who'd learned to expect nothing from the world but what he could wrest from it with his own hands. Clarice shared the story of her marriage's collapse, the betrayal that had left her stranded in a foreign country with a child and no resources, the months of desperation that had brought her to his door. In the growing darkness outside, with Benji sleeping peacefully upstairs and the fire crackling in the hearth, they began to understand that what they were building together was more than just a practical arrangement. It was the slow, careful construction of something that might, if they were brave enough to tend it properly, grow into the kind of love that could heal old wounds and create new possibilities. The knowledge sat between them like a secret they weren't quite ready to speak aloud, but it colored every interaction, every shared glance, every moment when their hands brushed as they passed dishes or reached for the same book, until the very air in the house seemed charged with the electricity of potential, of two people discovering that sometimes the most unexpected gifts come wrapped in the plainest packages. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping across the Irish countryside with a ferocity that seemed determined to test every bond that had been forged in the gentler months before. The house, which had felt spacious and welcoming in autumn's golden light, drew inward around them like a cocoon, forcing an intimacy that might have felt suffocating if it hadn't been built on the solid foundation of trust they'd spent months constructing. Clarice found herself grateful for the storm that raged outside their windows, for the way it made their small circle of warmth feel not like a prison, but like a sanctuary, a place where the three of them could exist without the weight of the outside world pressing against their fragile happiness. The nights grew longer and colder, and with them came a shift in the careful choreography they'd maintained throughout the autumn. Thomas began lingering longer at the kitchen table after dinner, his eyes following Clarice as she moved through the evening rituals of putting Benji to bed, reading him stories in the soft voice that had become as much a part of the house's rhythm as the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. When she would return downstairs, she would find Thomas waiting, not with the polite distance he'd maintained in the early days, but with something that looked almost like hunger, a need for her presence that he was finally allowing himself to acknowledge. One evening, as the wind howled around the corners of the house and the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, Clarice found herself standing closer to Thomas than propriety might have dictated, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes and to feel the warmth radiating from his body. They had been discussing something mundane, the need for more firewood, perhaps, or plans for the spring planting, but the words had faded into insignificance, replaced by the electric awareness of proximity, of two people who had been circling each other for months, finally acknowledging the gravity that had been pulling them together all along. "Clarice," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer, like something sacred that he'd been afraid to speak aloud. His hand rose to touch her face, fingers tracing the line of her cheek with a reverence that made her breath catch in her throat, and she realized that this moment had been inevitable from the first night she'd slept under his roof, that all their careful politeness and respectful distance had been nothing more than a dance around the truth that they belonged to each other now, had perhaps always belonged to each other, waiting only for circumstances to bring them together. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate tenderness of a man who had given up hope of ever feeling this kind of connection again, and she responded with the fierce gratitude of a woman who had learned that love, when it finally arrives, should be claimed with both hands and held tight against the storms that would inevitably come. They made love that night with the slow, careful passion of people who understood that what they were creating together was precious and fragile, something that needed to be tended with the same patience and devotion they had brought to healing each other's wounds. In the morning, Clarice woke in Thomas's arms, Benji's laughter drifting up from the kitchen below, where Thomas must have taken him to let her sleep, and she understood that this was what home felt like. Not a place, but a collection of people who had chosen to build something beautiful together out of the broken pieces of their separate lives. The future stretched before them, uncertain as all futures must be, but no longer frightening because they would face it together, three souls who had found in each other the courage to believe in tomorrow. The house around them seemed to exhale with satisfaction, as if it too had been waiting for this moment, for the completion of the family it had been designed to shelter. Outside, the storm was beginning to break, and through the windows came the first pale light of a new day, illuminating the faces of the people who had learned that sometimes the most profound love stories begin not with passion, but with the simple revolutionary act of offering shelter to a stranger and discovering that in saving someone else, you have somehow managed to save yourself.